welcome to Graphic Policy Radio. This is your host, Ilana Levin, and this is a comics podcast. A comics podcast in which we discuss comics. I know that's a very far out there thing to talk about in such a day and age. Really glad to folks joining us on the show and have an exciting guest who is a cartoonist herself and also a really brilliant critic whose work I've enjoyed reading many times. I'm joined by Sarah Horrocks. She is an Eisner-nominated comic artist and critic from Oklahoma. She has a BA in English from Tulane University in New Orleans. She has done cover work for various Image and Boom Studio projects, as well as comics for anthologies across a spectrum of publications and publishers, including the Eisner-nominated Twisted Romance from Image Comics. She has written critically for Fantagraphics, Comics Alliance, Study Group Magazine, and the Comics Journal. She hosted the Trash Twins podcast with fellow cartoonist Katie Schiele, which I definitely enjoyed, and you guys can still find it online. Her major comics work include Dysnomia, Hecate Snake Diaries, The Leopard, Goro, Euripides the Bacchae, and her latest work, Aorta. Most of these can be purchased either in print or digital editions through her website, mercurialblonde.squarespace.com. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I had on some of the creative team from Twisted Romance back when that comic came out, but there was like a lot of you guys, and there was no way to schedule to have everybody be on. So I'm glad we're finally having the opportunity to chat about your work.
Yeah, I think that was the first time I listened to your podcast. I think you had...
Yeah. And Trungles and Alex, yeah. And that was just like a project with so many interesting artists and voices who, some of whom I'd been aware of, some of whom were new to me. And I'd known your critical work before then, but I don't think I'd actually read your comics until that point. And it was really cool because you're someone whose work goes through a lot of different genres, but it's always very like sensationalistic and emotional. And it was cool to see sort of your kind of horror-tinged stuff in a romance anthology. So you are a cartoonist, and by that I mean you draw and write, and you're doing all your own coloring, all of your own lettering, you're handling all the different elements of the piece of work that you're creating. What is it that draws you to doing comics as a particular...
I don't know. That's a good question. It's a pretty crazy medium to choose to work in. I know that like when I was really young, I wanted to be a writer, and for the longest time, I was just thinking of like writing the Great American Novel and stuff like that. And in my teens, though, I read Alan Moore's The Watchmen, and I was like. I mean, I had read comics kind of growing up, but that was the first time that I read something, and I was like, "Whoa, I could totally like do something in this medium." And so initially, I was like, "Oh, I want to be a comics writer." So I spent a lot of time kind of just working on that angle, but I couldn't really get anyone to draw my scripts. I didn't have any money to sort of pay anyone. So I was like, I guess I need to learn how to like draw. First I was like, I started doing these like collage comics where I would like cut up images from movies and like fashion magazines and make comics out of them. And so my first like 2 or 3 years in comics were making these like web comic cut up comics, and just kind of in like Photoshop basically. Mm-hmm. And then I was getting to the point though where like to make like a single hand, I had to like cut up like all these like different fingers, and like it was really involved. And I was just like, it'd be better if I just like learned how to draw a hand. And this was like 7 or 8 years ago probably. So then I was like, just kind of started learning how to draw so I could make comics, and now that's where I'm at now. I think that's why my like coloring and sort of composition is probably always been a little farther along than everything else, because I had like 2 years where that was my main focus.
That's so fascinating. I mean, it's such a different approach to learning how to make the art. I think that a lot of times people figure if they don't have realistic drawing skills and ability to pull it out rapidly by a certain age, then no matter what other kinds of visual storytelling skills you might have because you studied, film or something like that, like you just can't possibly render it into a comic yourself. But your whole thing is like, no, screw that. I'm actually going to figure this out and do it.
Yeah, I think it's I'm not sure why I thought I could like learn how to draw like that, but I just kind of I think because I had kind of gotten to that point with like writing and sort of the process for developing as a writer, I just kind of like mapped that onto like learning how to draw, and it worked pretty well. I mean, I couldn't draw anything. Like I've shown people like the stuff that I was drawing when I first started, and it's like I think people are always like shocked, but it is just a skill that you sort of develop if you just have to kind of like do it enough, and then you get better at it. And I mean, I'm still constantly improving and trying to improve.
It's interesting because I sort of think of myself as being like a failed illustrator. I drew all the time when I was a kid, and I won like every contest, and I was constantly in art classes and all this. And then at some point in my youth, everybody else kind of caught up with me, and I couldn't like get past that point. And it's just the thought of the physical rigor of having to develop the ability to do all those things just really knocks me out when I think about it. Like, it is so laborious.
Yeah, I mean, I drew up until like off and on when I was like really little, up until like I don't know, like sort of middle elementary school, because I had a lot of bad experiences with drawing as a kid, where like I had like an art teacher that like made fun of the way I drew, and like
what the fuck, they should go to jail. I am like,
and I had like a school guidance counselor that like threatened to like call my parents because I was drawing like these really like graphic like drawings in my sketchbook that like they found. And so I was just like, from that point, I was just like, well, I'm just going to be a writer, because like most people like don't read, or I can get away with more writing. I had more like positive, like all my English teachers and everyone like totally loved my writing from the get-go. So I had more sort of positive reinforcement there. So, I mean, I think the advantage of doing it the way that I did it is that like I didn't really pick up like influences from childhood. So like when I was ready to start learning how to draw, my influences I kind of got to pick like as an adult. So like if I had started to draw, if I had like drawn through my childhood and teens, my style would be much more influenced by like Rob Liefeld, Todd McFarlane, like people like that. Whereas starting when I did, I was more like influenced by Egon, Schiele, Klimt, and like Guido, Crepax, and people like that.
That makes so much sense, though. Yeah, that really does. Like what goes into making the art that you make is so tied to like how your level of like maturity in art you're consuming when you're working on it. Frankly, I also was not really aware of the Italian comics artist who you cited in the beginning of the Bacchae as being a huge inspiration for you. But when I looked up his work, I was like, oh, I super see his style in your work as well. And it's like, yeah, there's like no reality in which you as like a little kid would have been checking out, like probably wasn't even translated into English, back then. I'm blanking on his name. Help me out.
Pazinza. Like his,
yeah.
I think his book just came out. The collection of his work just came out in English, like 2 or 3 years ago for Zanardi. It was when I was working on Goro that came out, and it was something. It was kind of a revelation, because like the way that he's able to draw in a lot of styles on the page, but it all fits because like he's the one drawing it. Like really opened things up for me on Goro. So I think Goro was more. Started out as me sort of processing my sort of influence of Kyoko Okazaki, and he seen his stuff at the time. It sort of became a big influence on the way that book looks as well, I think.
And now here's where I sound like a total like idiot, but like Kyoko Okazaki, who is that?
She did Helter Skelter is her big book. She also did a book called Pink. I think they're both from Vertigo. Yeah, she's like really, really good. Like she's one of my favorites. It's just a lot of, it's like slice of life josei type stuff. She was like, her assistant was Miyoko Ano. So like her stuff is kind of like a raw punker version of like that style.
Okay. Yeah, I'm like just a total like American and British comic chauvinist who doesn't know their international stuff at all. So I'm really like very conscious of how that limits my ability to like understand and analyze comics art, but I still like there's just so much work out there. It's hard to figure out like where to work it into the curriculum of things I already read. But it was exciting to sort of have that entry point in the character design, and thanks, just like, so like, I guess what I'm saying is thank you for citing that reference, because like folks like me are just not going to know. And I think it's really cool when creators do that.
Yeah, it all came about because of, I did a thing for the Island anthology that was like about her work. And instead of, because I think originally when Brandon like pitched it to me, he just kind of wanted me to like write an article on Kyoko Okazaki, and then I decided that I wanted to do I wanted to redraw her panels and stuff that I was talking about, and then like put the sort of critical analysis in the work itself. And in the process of doing that, I kind of like really enjoyed the style and also thought it kind of mixed well with what I was doing. So I was like, let me see. And then I did like a short comic called Goat Lord, which is like a 5-page mini comic that I put in The Leopard. And that was sort of in that style as well. And so I was like kind of interested in doing a longer work in that style. And that was kind of the genesis of the sort of visual impulse of Goro, with some other things, but like for the most part that was like the thing that I was kind of working through visually the most.
And Goro is like very much a soap opera, like rich people fighting, freaking out at each other, interfamilial drama. Like I actually don't watch Succession, but I'm gonna guess it's kind of like Succession. So it's like it's definitely like a really dramatic, turn everything on dialed to 11 kind of a story, which actually is, I think, pretty. You're a very dialed to 11 person in terms of the comics too. So
yeah, well, it's interesting because I like, as a person I'm very like chill, but like the stuff that I'm into is like the opposite of that. So like I kind of explain, even though I like work across a lot of different like genres, like my main interest in comics is like the spaces of like heightened emotion. I feel like comics are like at their best when like the characters are like in some sort of like heightened space, and so they have like, you know, they're yelling something, they're crying, they're like, you know, having some deep emotional experience. I feel like that really conveys really well in comics. Like you think about like all those like Kirby and Ditko like panels of people, of characters like with these like contorted, agonized faces, and like how well that like translates. So whatever genre I'm working in is always kind of like geared towards that, and working in a kind of like soap opera story was like a very obvious way for me to do that. Like I was very influenced by like 80s soap operas and like the sort of primetime like Dallas and Dynasty and some and like telenovelas as well. Like just stuff where like the plot is very like fast and there's all these like sort of trashy turns and like people are like saying very direct and mean things to each other. It's very, very opposite to like the life that I was raised in, and so I have I guess I've just sort of developed a interest in that, because usually like for my families, it was always very like sort of passive aggressive, and nobody would like say anything. Whereas like, so I always like fiction and stuff where characters are very direct and very like emotionally open.
Yeah, I that makes a lot of sense for looking at your work. I mean, I'm trying to think how to describe like, you know, like Goro as like in terms of the storyline. I mean, you're having a moment where this like super rich family, like is it like the transition of like who's like the leader of the family. Like I guess he's incapacitated on you know, and you have all the younger generation fighting for who's going to lead it. And I feel like I can say, as someone who hasn't watched any Succession, but who has listened to a really good podcast about Succession, that I think that people who are interested in Succession might want to consider this as a comics exploration of the genre, because it just seems like it's right there in that feeling.
Yeah, I need to see Succession, because I didn't really know. I've seen like trailers where it looked cool, but like I saw like people talking about like a blood cult or something for the newest season, and I was like, maybe I should be watching this.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, like I don't have HBO right now, which listeners is why we don't have any coverage of Watchmen, although there's lots of reasons for that also. But it's sort of like, I'm thinking it like it's also supposed to be absurdist, you know, and funny, you know. I don't like rich people porn. It makes me just want to punch them. But if we can like actually laugh, and then I think that's an important piece of it. The piece of your work that I really connected with actually is the Bacchae. I haven't read Euripides in a million years, but back in college, that was work that I really enjoyed, and it was really fun to sort of just jump back into that story. How did the Bacchae come about for you as a work, like to do your own take of the Bacchae, basically?
I just gotten in the mode of reading like a lot of like classics. I think because like Anne Carson did a bunch of like really great translations of a lot of like great stuff, and I was kind of reading through like Seneca and Euripides and Asclepiades. And
yeah, like who can say? I think I thought it was Aeschylus, but like who the fuck?
Yes,
I don't.
something.
They're all. It's just like I don't know. Sorry. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I was gonna. So like, but when I read the Bacchae, like it was just so like vivid in my head of like it being this very like queer, transgressive like piece of art, and I just kind of like had all these like images in my head that I sort of immediately wanted to translate into something. So it was just kind of like an immediate reaction to the material. Like there's like two works that I wanted to adapt to, and that was like that one, or I wanted to do Electra by our aforementioned however you pronounce his name.
Aeschylus, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the Bacchae has more like themes that I wanted to explore. So like there's like two in terms of like trans stuff to adapt, like the Bacchae, and then there's like a section in Byron's Don Juan that is has like cross-dressing and all this stuff, that it has like very like queer messaging that I thought was interesting, so I may do that someday.
Ooh, I feel like there's a big audience for that. I've actually not read Don Juan, but like I don't know, a lot of people have, and if they haven't, we all kind of feel like we should have probably. So I think that would be really, really cool to see.
Yeah. So yeah, it's like just kind of stuff like that. So yeah, that was kind of it's kind of interesting to see like the differing responses to that adaptation because it's my Bacchae adaptation, because like I debuted it at Thought Bubble in England, and like it was very popular there. Like I had all these like classics professors and people like that like walking by my table and like freaking out about it.
Ooh, and I love it.
So like I got home and I was like, oh, I need to like, you know, print a bunch of copies of this because obviously people are going to really like it, but it's just not nearly as popular in America as it is like overseas. So I guess like America doesn't necessarily love the classics quite as much, except for America, you, I guess.
America just isn't ready for Euripides, you know?
Yeah.
I honestly feel like Euripides is definitely the most modern feeling ancient art I've ever encountered. And this story is like such a queer story. And one of the things that I love about what you're doing is like, at least I read into it as like a lot of the dialogue between generations of people sort of felt like, oh yeah, this feels like some of the conflicting, this feels like some internal community arguments in like the LGBTQ community. I don't know if that was like a deliberate thing, but for me, I was like, yeah, we're going to like talk about respectability politics right now, I guess. And like,
well, it's just nuts how like old a text that is, and like all that stuff is still there. Like people try to act like all this stuff is new, and it's like you can find like, because like everyone's like thinks that like transgender stuff is like something that was invented on Tumblr like 5 years ago, whereas like it's in like Euripides like in BC, and I mean even the Bible like has like passages like basically like railing against us, because so it's like not like people can't say we haven't been here for forever. even in like Western culture, like
right,
which is sort of typical to try to act like it's like every 10 years people try to like rediscover like trans people, and it's like annoying.
Yeah, it's really, really oppressive and awful. I mean, but the thing that I love though is like so much of this pre-modern, pre-Christian art though is like how it doesn't have the same like hang-ups around these things. Like there are definitely socially constructed acceptable ways to transgress gender and others that are not, but it's still like built into the system, like, hey, everyone's going to go wear women's clothing at this particular holiday, like this is a thing we do. Oh wow, like this character changes their gender and that's how we know that they're extra powerful. Like this is not stuff I'm like pulling out of the air. Like this is in Greek texts.
Well, even like something like Satyricon, which is like later in Rome, like it's almost coming from like a different world entirely, like in terms of like values and in terms of like how sort of gender works within society. And it's like in some ways it's regressive, but in other ways it's very progressive compared to now. And it's, I don't know, it's just very fascinating. I mean, it makes a lot of sense when you watch Fellini's adaptation of Satyricon, like how alien he's made it look, how it's like almost like a sci-fi movie. I think that was also an influence in terms of like how I approached the Bacchae, was like Pasolini and Fellini's adaptations in terms of like how otherworldly they could seem at times. I don't know. I'm real excited to get to the like crazy stuff at the back half of the Bacchae though, because like I haven't really gotten to draw like the second issue of the Bacchae has a little bit of stuff, but like I can't wait to get like to the really good stuff.
Yeah, that story is definitely becomes more explosive and body parts and gory and sensationalist as it continues. It's not a spoiler if I'm telling you about something that happens in a pre-modern story, okay, kids? So that'll be really interesting and exciting to see, I'm sure. But yeah, like, I don't know. I just really saw the argument between the generations of, like, felt like a lot of, like, young people deciding that they were going to police their elders about decadence.
Yeah, it's interesting because Pentheus is much more conservative and regressive than his forebears to like his detriment, and it's that kind of repression which destroys him.
And you have him in this crazy amazing muscle suit jacket
Yeah, I felt like that like very much conveys like his sort of it's like it's kind of like masculinity and that like toxic masculinity in like a visual form.
I
It's
mean,
like
it's an amazing design.
this like
costume.
scared little man in like a big muscle costume.
Yeah. Oof. So when you're doing your own work and you're publishing it yourself, when it comes to pieces like this, like how do you decide how you're going to break things up into stories, like chapters, and like what kind of pace is achievable and realistic for you doing all of these things yourself?
Well, with the Bakai, it's pretty easy in terms of like I'm pretty much just breaking it up into the acts, and then like it's somewhat limited in terms of the pages. Like there's like a certain sort of page count I want to fit it in between, just because of like cost, and also just kind of like it like fits better. But with like Goro, the chapters are all like vary a lot in length. So like the last volume of Goro is like 60 pages. So it's like a quarter of the book. Whereas like some of the middle volumes of Goro are very slim, like 20 pages, 22 pages. And it was just kind of like what felt like a contained like chapter to put out. If it needed to be longer, then it would be longer, and if it needed to be shorter, it'd be shorter. But what I'm trying to do with the newer book that I'm working on, Aorta, is do longer chunks. So like the first Aorta book is I think 60 pages, and I'm trying to kind of keep to that, because I was like taking Goro to conventions and stuff and having like eight copies of 8 issues was very difficult. So I'm trying to have like maybe 4 or 5 issues that are like just very big. The downside of that is like financially it's not financially it's a little bit more perilous in terms of like when I was doing Goro, I was pretty much doing it like every month or every other month. And so I'd have a new book selling like in that time period, which kind of kept things consistent. Whereas doing it the way that I'm doing it now, there's a lot more time where I don't have like something out. But the sales so far have been strong enough to make up for that, so it hasn't been like an issue.
It's super inspiring though, like that you're just making your own art and like putting it out and doing all this stuff yourself, and like that there's an audience that's like ready and interested and like really smart and like non-superhero focused. Not saying that those things are antithetical, because obviously I don't think they are, but you're doing comics that aren't in the dominant genre, as it were, and you're doing stuff that like you're just really doing it on your own, and that there's like a an audience and an appetite for it.
Yeah, well, there's like it's kind of interesting, because like I have like readers that I interact with who are like they're like, the way they like first came across me was like through like my critical writing, and then like they saw my comics, but they're coming from like a totally outside part of comics that's not traditionally kind of serviced. So it's like, I don't know, it's kind of interesting. Like I feel like there's a wider audience for my stuff than I've even like connected to so far, and it's just like the baby steps to like connecting with them. But it's just because like the traditional means of like comics connecting to those people is not good. So it's like I don't know, I'm trying to like kind of like work my way around comics to like get to those people, because my stuff doesn't necessarily fit into a lot of the sort of set categories and sort of patterns. Like it's not necessarily like in alt indie type work, and it's not necessarily like, if anything, it's like kind of that middle band that sometimes like image books fall into, but it's not quite that either, because it's got like this like European and manga sensibility as well. So I don't know, it's just kind of like figuring out how to position my work within that. And it's really when you do it yourself, it's kind of cool, because it's like you can actually like be in control of everything, and you can kind of like see who's buying what, and sort of have kind of a direct connection to your sales, because you're literally like stuffing the envelopes. And it's, yeah, you just get to kind of keep more of what you sell than if I were working with like a small press or something.
Yeah, I think a lot of the small press appeal is somebody else dealing with your mailing, and if you're not someone who's already known, you know, the promotion, but like you're already coming with a brand, so that it would literally just be managing your mailing at that point. That would be the virtue.
Yeah, I mean, the only real downside is like when I'm done with something, like it's still probably, it's too expensive to like just for me to just collect something on my own. So I have been kind of looking and pitching to publishers as far as like collecting Goro, and then, you know, if nothing comes of that, then I will just like Kickstarter it or something, because I do think that like having a collected version of that people can just have like one thing to get will be really helpful. And it'll also give me something, because like I haven't really, with the exception of like Escape Pod in New York, there's, and maybe like Floating World to some extent, I haven't really like put my comics in like shops that aggressively, because it's like the selling at like wholesale and everything, it's like I lose a little bit on sales to do that. And so I'm like sort of reticent sometimes to like go down that path, whereas if I had like one book, it'd be easier to also just kind of pitch to shops and kind of get into shops for that stuff. So I don't know, that's kind of the next stage that I'm like building toward. But if nothing else, like I'll have the aorta will be sort of much shorter in terms of like number of volumes, but they'll be much longer. So I think that'll be satisfying for people, I hope.
Yeah. I guess for me, like I like when I can store stuff with my other comics well. So I always have had a hard time buying mini comics, because like it like breaks my like storage system. So luckily your stuff isn't. So
my stuff's very big.
Exactly. So there you go. From a create like from a very like craft based thing, I just really want to talk to you about Zipatone. Zipatone or Screen Tone. I guess they were calling it Chart Pack, Letrotron. I don't freaking know. But when I was learning how to do comics, like in like a kid class in like the year 1989 or something, like they were all about bringing out this like transfer paper that, you know, you rub on the page and you use that to fill in different kinds of shadings. And, you know, like comic strips, like for the, you know, in the newspaper, you know, you use those a lot. Like Luke McDonnell over doing Suicide Squad, you know, in the 80s is like the king of it. I love what he does. And then there's a lot of folks in manga who use it. It just feels like people kind of forgot about Zipatone, and you're doing your work digitally predominantly, and you're like the queen of Zipatone.
Well, yeah, I mean, I just do that stuff digitally because it's cheaper than trying to buy like all the sheets, and it's a little bit faster. But yeah, just Clip Studio has some really good tones, and you can like modify them pretty well. So I mean, that's just kind of, I like having the it's like another layer of expression that I can have in my work. I don't really use it necessarily as like a restrained like shading thing, as much as I use it as like a another mark on the page or another like sort of expressionistic like shape to sort of like amplify what I'm trying to like show or like balance out like the composition of the page, which is, again, that's something that I got from Kyoko Okazaki. Like, if you see her work, you'll kind of see a definite bridge between the two, because she was the first one I saw that really just kind of like didn't give a fuck about where she was putting that stuff. She just like, it didn't have to be directly aligned on the character, and it would just be like kind of like, it has like this very like punk sensibility the way that she does it, and I really like that. I like that sort of freedom of like, I'm gonna put this here because like, fuck you, basically. and so I kind of yeah, because I've always been really into like texture, like Alberto Breccia is a big influence. He's a Argentine comics creator that is just now starting to get more of his work put into English, but I've been reading his work for like 10 years or something. His work's like extremely textural, and you can even like, even like my earlier work, you can see like I used to like ink with like razor blades, and like I would like cut up my ink and all this stuff. So I've always been like,
yeah, I remember seeing some of those.
Yeah, I think for Twisted Romance I did a little bit of that type of thing. That anthology, I did something closer to that style. But yeah, I always like kind of the textures of pages and like the expressiveness of ink. It's something that's kind of gone out a little bit in terms of like American comics, and because of like the way that coloring has changed and the coloring techniques, so people, to sort of compensate with modern coloring, are not using as much ink as they used to like express like dimension and stuff. But I really miss that stuff. I like stuff that's like flat colors but like very expressive ink.
Yeah. Do you feel like part of that is just like because you connect it with the aesthetics of comics that you like, or is there like is it like or is it like I mean, I know you're saying you're not using it because you are trying to have like a more limited like palette for those reasons, but I don't know. I'm always trying to sort of get a handle on why do I like the look of something.
Well, I don't know, because for me, like that, a lot of the sort of shading and coloring techniques for like modern comics look very plasticky to me. Like you'll see like light sourcing on like jeans that make them look like they're like sort of plastic as opposed to like denim. And so I just feel like ink, like pen and ink is a lot more expressive, unless you're like going like full on like painted comics, or like I mean, there are some colorists out there who are more textural in like a really interesting way. Like there's some stuff by like Matt Wilson sometimes has like weird textures and stuff, but for the most part, like it's all kind of like done in such a samey way that it's just not that interesting to me. I just feel like that like there's more sort of dimension and layers with like the ink. Like I feel like a lot of artists, especially like older artists, were operating at like a higher fidelity than like the sort of even like good colorists today are necessarily, in terms of like the things that they can express on the page. Like there's just like the level of craft that like a lot of top level comics artists have had through the years, and like even still today can be like, it's kind of the most amazing part of the industry to me. Like it's something that's done like at a higher level than any other aspect, I think, at times. So I don't know. I've just always kind of been drawn to stuff that's more expressive on that end. But I do like, I mean, there are things in coloring that I do like, but it's just, I I'm more when it comes to color. I think I'm more interested in terms of like palette choices and in terms of like contrast sometimes. Though I mean, I do still like those kind of muddy Vertigo comics, even though they're like, because I was kind of in vogue sometimes to like bash those, but they work for me on some level too. The like Steve Bichette like recoloring of that like old Alan Moore stuff, and it was like they've just been so sort of robbed of their dimensionality, even though it was like still like the same like marks on the page, but because of the rendering techniques by the recolors, it had kind of like distracted from that enough that you kind of lose the individuality and character of that like style and that work.
Yeah. There's a really good essay by Sarah Century about the problem with all of these recolored comics. You know, and I just think that like the coloring used at the time is part of an aesthetic look that's specific to a time and place, and if you like take that away, it doesn't look period anymore, and looking period is part of the art, you know. I make exception for like sometimes I'll be looking at Silver Age comics where I swear to you, like, you know, you have black characters whose skin is colored gray as opposed to brown. And if they want to figure out a way to have that not be the case while still being like in the style appropriate, then like that's a different story. But like trying to make everything have this weird new polish is just, it looks weird and it's misguided.
Yeah, well, like someone said on Twitter about it, and I think they're right, is that the focus should be on restoration instead of recolorization. It's just that restoration obviously takes more time and money, whereas recolorization is cheap and fast. But it's just, it's such a shame because it just kind of goes to this thing where like comics are just not being treated as like an art form that should be like, you know, archived and like maintained like in the same like level that like film does, you know.
Well, you know, I remember, you know, we used to have those big, well, I didn't, but a lot of people had those big Marvel anthologies that had no color at all. They were just like the telephone book of the stories, and I can't imagine like a medium that takes itself seriously thinking that was an okay way to release something.
That's
like,
how I got like the early Claremont Byrne X-Men stuff.
It's how everyone did. Right? I mean, well, so everyone our age did, you know.
And I was like, well, why was this such a big deal? Because it didn't like hit me quite as hard, I guess, in black and white like that. And then I later saw it in like color, and I'm like, oh, this would have been like a lot different if I had seen it with all the colors involved.
Yeah. I mean, God, talking about Watchmen, one of my big things with Watchmen is like, I think the color work on that, although I've met a few people who don't like it, but like I think the color work on Watchmen is like one of the most important things in that comic, and is some of the best color work ever. And like, I can't imagine thinking that you could just have that comic be done any other way and that it wouldn't matter.
John Higgins is for me as important to that book as like Dave Gibbons and Alan Moore. Like
totally,
that like he just nails Gibbons' art. I actually read a comic by him called I think it's called like The End of the World or something. He did it with Jamie Delano.
Oh, and wow.
It's like a really crazy painted comic, and it's like really metal and insane and great. Definitely recommended. I had no idea that he like did comics besides like coloring, but he's an incredible artist.
I did not know that either. Well, I know that you're also a really big fan of like Bill Sienkiewicz, if I'm not mistaken. I did not have an opportunity to read the new, I guess he just released something with Marvel, but definitely an artist whose work I see an influence of on yours, who also, you know, coming from X-Men land, as it were.
Well, like one of he was definitely especially an early influence in terms of like, I I think I was reading like Stray Toasters, and my partner like was like, oh, that's Klimt and that's Schiele, and sort of that was how I discovered Klimt and Schiele was actually through Sienkiewicz, and that was like a big, obviously a big influence on my art style and the direction, especially my early art took. Was trying to sort of make like Egon Schiele comics.
Yeah.
Or Egon Schiele. But
I know,
yeah.
I don't know either.
Yeah.
But I think he's like definitely an artist that a lot of comics artists speak to, because it's illustrative, and these characters and these people and these bodies and these poses are so compelling.
Well, and he's another one like Pazinzo, who like will flip through styles depending on like what he thinks is like the most impactful emotionally, which was always been something that I related to in terms of comics. Like I don't necessarily believe in sort of maintaining a certain consistency, where I'm like, if I want to draw like a panel this way or color something this way, like I will, because I feel like it's like right for the moment, and that's sort of like my overarching thing. And he's an artist that also works in that way. And so it's just like he's always been someone whose work I've related to a lot. For me, Stray Toasters and Electra Assassin are like two like monster works of comics. We did a Trash Twins on Electra Assassin actually, and yeah, love that book. It's still, every time I read it, like it gets better. It's like one of those books like Watchmen you can read 30 times.
Yeah. So you were talking about how in your work, if there's a just different style that you want to access to be able to make a particular visual point, you just do it. Periodically, I see like there was like a Dragon Ball, or I don't remember. I'm terrible. I see it in there's a couple of pages in Aorta where he cropped up, and you're probably going to tell me actually, Ilana, it's a completely different manga character, and that I'm crazy, but no,
like one of the characters is based on the Trunks from Dragon Ball.
Yes. So talk to me about like that, like what is the Dragon Ball like bringing into the story there, and what does Dragon Ball like? I've just always really hated the art of Dragon Ball, and so many people whose art I respect really like it, and I'm still hoping someday somebody will help me understand like the appeal, and you're a visual artist and you recognize this, so hopefully you can help me understand these things, because I have failed so many times.
I mean, I wish that I could. Like for me, like that character was just like I had the idea of the basic like character design in my head, and then like I really liked the I wanted a character that had kind of that high forehead that some of Toriyama's characters have, and that's how the design ended up coming about. Like it's not nothing like too complex. I've only sort of read like sort of smatterings of Dragon Ball and Toriyama's work in general. I'm not like a huge fan of his, but some of his stuff is really cool. I think like the early first part of Dragon Ball like looks like amazing. Then there's like sort of later parts that I've looked at that aren't quite as impressive for me, but in general, like I would say his stuff just has like a very like interesting sort of sense of humor, and it's very sort of kinetic. But I'm definitely not like a huge sort of Dragon Ball fan to like convert you or anything. Like I still have to like read a lot on that. No,
and I don't even want to be converted to the actual virtues of the text. It's more just like, for me, the barrier was always just the art. I was like, I don't like the eyes that are vertical as opposed to horizontal, this bothers me. And like this dates back to childhood. This is not like Ilana making an adult-driven aesthetic judgment. This was like Ilana is a kid watching cartoons and being like, I will not watch that cartoon. The eyes are done incorrectly, and like being a little fascist about it. But it was a visual palette like you wanted to play with in there. Like, I definitely think that his particular character in Aorta felt like super, just like animated and like, I don't know, action-driven and youthful, from that association, so.
Yeah, I would say that character is sort of a mixture of Toriyama and then, like, very sort of muscular, sort of Baki the Grappler, like, stuff. But, yeah, that character gets to do a whole lot more in the second issue. But... yeah,
so
I think
in Aorta you're drawing mechs, like that's crazy hard.
For me, I just kind of approach it more as like sort of lots of sharp edge like shapes and stuff. Like it's for me, I was thinking more of like futurism and abstract expressionism and stuff like that. Like I'm real excited to like draw like very like big like fights and stuff like later in the comic with like all these like geometric like lasers going across in different directions with like all the shapes and motion going across like panels and pages and people like screaming emotionally like through space and metal like just sort of like very interested in that part. Like for me, my interest in mech comics or mechs in general is the idea of like people trying to connect emotionally like through machines across the void of like nothingness. And it's all kind of like it's always about like sort of entering this sort of ecstatic state where they go beyond the borders of like their like body and sort of connect on like a soul level with like existence and like their place within the world. And I feel like this is kind of like a consistent like theme and thing and like the moments I relate most to in like the mech genre. And so like that's sort of the stuff that I'm most excited to explore and like deal with. Which won't happen until right now in the comic. It's like you have to like set up like sort of the sort of baseline story and everything, so all that stuff actually hits when it happens. But
right.
I'm excited. That's my interest in the mech genre, is that sort of emotional, ecstatic, apocalyptic state, which is pretty consistent across like all my comics. I think all my comics have some sort of apocalyptic thing that happens and like changes things right at the end. I think it's probably comes from like watching too much Evangelion as a kid. And just kind of I think there's also like a basic like trans thing in that, in terms of like coming out in your, because I came out like when I was like 22, 23, and then that's such like a kind of apocalyptic thing unto itself, like the sort of your sort of heightened emotional state, like going into it, and then like all the upheaval and like tension and everything like at the time, and then like coming out of it like changed, and you're still you, but you have a better like place within the world, more sort of alive within your existence. And so I mean, because I've noticed that in all my work, and I've kind of been trying to kind of figure out why it's there, and that's my best guess is that it's linked to that sort of thing. But it could also just be like I had a very religious upbringing, and Revelation was always like a very spooky book.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I mean, I think that's a really great way to talk about the appeal of mechs. It's just never been my we used to joke on the show that like Brett was into robot fighting and wasn't into sword and sorcery, and for us, and for me it was vice versa, or more even so, sword and sandal. He like will not even go to Conan, but I'm like, I don't want to really care about robots punching each other. But when described in the terms that you used, it feels a lot more impactful and compelling. So
there's some good sword and sorcery mech like anime out there, like Escaflowne and Aura Battler Dumbean are both like sword and sorcery mech things inexplicably.
I mean, just like you could have a mech doing almost anything, really.
Yeah. Well, because like in Escaflowne, they're almost like almost dragons in a way that like people are kind of like inside of. They're sort of biologically connected, which is something that like comes up in aorta. Like the aorta machine like connects to like the blood, and that's sort of like where that, and like there's like a vampirism aspect of it.
Well, that's a great connection to the name of the series. Oh, I want to ask you, Goro, what's behind the name?
It's sort of multi-tiered. One, there's a link in the book, sort of obliquely made to there's this like Japanese film series from the 70s called like Outlaw Assassin, and the assassin in that's name is Goro, and so I have the character named in the book after the woman says that he was like named after the this friend that they had from Japan, this assassin friend that they had from Japan. So it's like sort of a nod to those films. It was that, and also like I was getting in a mode where I decided I was just going to start naming my comics after Mortal Kombat characters. And,
that's a Mortal Kombat character?
Do what? Yeah. Goro is this like four-armed like behemoth boss character.
Oh, that guy! I could never play as him. Right.
Yeah.
Okay. See, before I began reading the comic, I thought Goro was sort of like a reference to like Giallo. I was like, thought it was a joke on that, but then I'm like, this is not a Giallo comic.
Yeah, it's not. Though there is crossover between like the leopard like familial dynamics and Goro's dynamics.
That makes sense too. Well,
oh no, I was just gonna say I think a lot of my comics end up having some sort of family and like a clustered space dynamic.
Yeah, I mean that's a good space to tell stories from. So. Yeah. Well, thank you for joining us on the show. I think like I have a good reading list. You gonna be at any cons soon or?
No, I usually just do like one or two cons a year, and I haven't really decided on what I'm gonna do next year. I just did SPX for the first time this year.
Oh, back in my hometown.
Yeah. I was kind of I didn't really know what to expect. It was interesting. Like I was for the longest time I had been kind of afraid of going to that show, just because like I had like a weird relationship to a lot of the people in that scene, but it ended up being really good. So I still think my favorite con is I'm wanting to say Thought Bubble, but it's not Thought Bubble. It's what's the one in Toronto? TCAF. TCAF is my favorite one. Thought Bubble was my second favorite, mostly just because of like the people. But TCAF is definitely my favorite con that I've been to so far. I love that con.
Yeah, I have never been, and I will probably want to go at some point. It's just in New York, it's like so hard to convince myself that I should like go and spend money to go to another con in which I will certainly not be making any significant amount of money, even if I like sell a piece. You know what I mean? Like as a you know, a comics writer, as a critic. You know.
Yeah,
but
that was definitely the
really
con
good.
that was definitely the con where I spent like the most amount of my like money on the floor, because it's just like it has the best balance of like European comics, Japanese comics, and like indie comics that I've ever seen. And the year I went, they had Inio Asano was a special guest. They always have like a really cool like manga guest, like Taiyo Matsumoto was there before, and Junji Ito this year or something.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, they always have like some, like, because Chris Butcher runs it, so he has like good connections to all that stuff. And yeah, it's there's always some like amazing Japanese manga artists that they bring over. That's like a once in a lifetime chance to actually see them and their work in person.
Well, I know Junji Ito had said that his wife actually does like all of the shading and like zip-tone work on his comics.
Oh wow, I don't think I knew
like,
that.
Yeah, like it was in some. It might have been in some interview. I think it was like in the back of like his cat comic book thing that I was given. So, given our earlier conversation, I'm just sort of like, yeah, like you should probably have her on the credits of your comics then, I'm thinking. Since your wife is not an extension of you. Just a thought.
They have, yeah, it's very, Japan has some issues to work through still when it comes to, like, gender and...
yeah, I mean, so do we, but we're each terrible in our own unique way.
Yes, that's true.
But I just was like struck by that. I was like, dude, she's your letterer. She's like your colorist. You should like put her in your credits for fuck's sake. Anyway, well, cool. So remind our guests again, they should be following you obviously on Twitter, where you are MECURIAL blonde, Mercurial blonde, a blonde who has a range of feelings. And your website is mercurialblonde.squarespace.com. Any other social media sites people should find you at?
If they just go to my website that has like connections to everything is pretty much at Mercurial Blonde. So I've managed to like corner that branding so far. It's like Instagram. That's my Instagram as well. And mostly I'm on Twitter, and I have a Patreon, which I've been doing started doing podcast episodes on about comics, and today I actually put out an episode reading my favorite poems, so we'll see how it's going.
Oh, that's really neat. Well, I know my listeners like listening to things, so I hope they will also listen to yours. And I have definitely enjoyed listening to the Trash Twins. I was like, women talking about Monera and Crepax, bring it.
Yeah, we both still get people coming up to us at shows talking about that, and people really loved it. I mean, it was just a kind of a thing where if you see both of our output since then, we've just been so busy with just comics. It was just kind of a thing where we either had to dedicate ourselves to being podcasters or make comics, and we both wanted to make comics. So yeah, that's kind of just how that went.
Whereas I am a podcaster. And that's right, folks. We'll continue to be Graphic Policy Radio. We're on every podcast platform, Spotify, iTunes, SoundCloud, you name it. You can always reach out to me on Twitter at ELANA_Brooklyn. That's Ilana_Brooklyn. And thanks for joining us. Like we always say on the show, keep it geeky.
Hey, thanks for watching the previous video from Graphic Policy Television. Just by watching, you help support our site. Thank you so much. Now, if you're watching these videos, you probably care about geeky things like movies, television, comic books, toys, games, video games, you name it. You can go and subscribe right now to our YouTube channel to stay in touch and catch all the new videos, or check out our website at graphicpolicy.com. There's a nice link on this end of the video. But as always, thank you for watching. Keep on rocking and keep it geeky.